week 14 of the fantasy football season, and here's the crucial week, the week before most playoffs for fantasy owners. And here's a few quarterbacks I would start this week. The first guy, Taysom Hill, of the New Orleans Saints. Taysom Hill, he came back as the starter last week versus the Dallas Cowboys after he was out for a while with concussion and other issues. So in that ball game, week 13 versus Dallas, 264 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, 4 intos, and 11 rush attempts for 101 yards. So right here in week 14, if he's good to go, because we know he's got a splint on his hand after injuring the finger versus the Cowboys in week 13. But he's got a great matchup week 14 at the New York Jets that give up the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. And if Hill's healthy and ready to go, like I mentioned, I think he easily could get in this one anywhere from 20 to 25 fantasy points. Because he gets 7 to 10 fantasy points off the bat pretty much, just running the football with either a touchdown or in yards. So right now, Taysom Hill's still available as well in 66% of fantasy leagues. But with a great matchup at the Jets, he's definitely a quarterback I would start this week. The second guy, Kirk Cousins of the Minnesota Vikings. Kirk Cousins here, it's been an up and down season. I know Adam Thielen most likely isn't going to play on Thursday Night Football versus the Pittsburgh Steelers, but the last few games here for Cousins, week 11 versus Green Bay, 341 pass yards, 3 touchdowns in that one. Week 12 versus the 49ers, 238 pass yards, 2 touchdowns in an into. And week 13 at Detroit, pretty good game here. 340 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, 6 rushing yards, and a fumble loss. So right here, this Viking team this season, tons of ball games where they've been in shootouts, and obviously Kirk Cousins in the middle of that. So week 14 versus Pittsburgh on Thursday Night Football, they give up the 17th most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. I think Cousins in this one, he could get anywhere from 250 to 300 yards with 2 touchdowns in this one, and he's definitely a quarterback I would start this week. The next quarterback's Ryan Tannehill of the Tennessee Titans. I know Tannehill, we don't have the full arsenal of his weapons with Julio Jones and A.J. Brown out of the lineup, but still with this good matchup versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, I think he could get going. Once again, it's Tannehill, week 10 versus the Saints, 213 pass yards, a touchdown, 1 rush yard for a TD. Week 11 versus Houston, 323 passing, a touchdown, 4 interceptions would hurt him. And then week 12 in New England, only 93 pass yards, a touchdown, and an into with 24 yards rushing. But this week here, it's just a matchup-based start is Tannehill. And right now, he's still owned in a bunch of fantasy leagues at 69%. But I think versus Jacksonville team coming off the bye, I could see him having a decent ball game, anywhere from 18 to 23 fantasy points. And if you're in a pinch here in a crucial week 14 matchup, I would start Tannehill if you got no other options. The next quarterback's Cam Newton of the Carolina Panthers. So Cam Newton, it was a disastrous ball game in week 12 for him, that he got benched for XFL standout quarterback P.J. Walker. But the first few games back for Newton, week 10 at Arizona with goal line obligations for Newton, 8 pass yards, a touchdown, and 14 rushing yards with a touchdown. Week 11 in his first start versus Washington of the year, 189 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, 46 yards rushing, and a TD. And then in week 12 in Miami, where he got benched, 92 yards passing, 2 intos, 5 rush yards, and a touchdown. So Newton, we know he'll get you anywhere from 6 to 9 fantasy points at least running the football. And this week, it's a great matchup, week 14 versus Atlanta, that give up the second most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I know it's tough to trust Newton after what we saw from him in week 12, but this is a matchup-based start, and Newton right now is available in 71% of fantasy leagues. And the 5th and final quarterback I would start this week is Joe Burrow of the Cincinnati Bengals. Joe Burrow got banged up with that pinky injury in week 13 versus the Los Angeles Chargers, but I think Burrow here could still throw the football decently, and he's got a pretty good matchup versus the 49ers that give up the 14th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And we even seen a struggle in Russell Wilson have a good game last week versus them. Week 11 in Vegas for Burrow, 148 pass yards, a touchdown, 11 rushing, and a fumble loss. Week 12 versus Pitt, 190 pass yards, a TD, and into 8 rushing yards and a touch. And then week 13 versus the Chargers, 300 pass yards, a touchdown, 2 intos, 6 rushing yards, a touchdown, and a fumble loss. I know he had 3 turnovers in that game versus the Chargers, but right here, this San Francisco defense is more vulnerable. And this Bengal team, they got to get back on track after losing by 19 to the Chargers. And I think it starts with Joe Burrow this week, even with the injured pinky, and he has a good game, so he's a quarterback I would start. So that's a few quarterbacks I would start for Week 14 of the fantasy football season.